Hello everyone, and welcome to this video introducing international business as both a field of study as well as an object of study. So we're going to start with the obvious question of what is international business, closely related to obviously what our international business is. And really the thing that tends to come to mind is international trade. So international business is selling things or buying things across international borders, so between individuals or firms in different countries. This is, of course, true if you're buying or selling goods, materials, or components, or even services between different countries, so across international borders. Then you are engaging in international trade, and therefore also you're engaging in international business. However, international business is far more than just international trade. So international trade has been going on for pretty much as long as people have been around and grouping themselves into distinct groups. There have been trading, buying and selling between different groups, and as those different groups solidified into different states and eventually different nations, that has continued. And that is something which has a significant impact on domestic economies. So it would be a mistake to think that there was such thing as a domestic economy within a state, and then at some point over the last few hundred years, we suddenly had international trade. International trade has always been with us, so domestic economies have always been working alongside differing levels of international trade, and that has had various impacts. Generally speaking, it results in increased competition, expanded markets, so individuals and companies in one country can address multiple markets and engage in competition against all the different firms and individuals within those extra markets. And for the consumer, it results in a much wider range of goods and services. It may be fairly obvious, but it's always worth pointing out that a huge range of goods really originate and are only native to particular regions of the world. So when you're thinking about spicing, whether it's turmeric or cumin, this is generally in South Asia as well as Southeast Asia. If you're thinking about salt, again, it's a nice basic thing, but only found in particular salt mines in particular parts of the world. So this kind of access to a much wider range of goods and services is a distinct direct impact of international trade. However, it would be a mistake to think of international business as simply consisting of buying and selling goods and services across borders. It is much broader than that. So when we think of international business as a field of study, it is far more complex. So the first thing to point out is that organizations, firms, and I guess individuals as well can operate across borders and in multiple markets in a number of different ways. So exporting and importing is a very long-standing method of international business, and we see this throughout history. But we have additional ways of understanding how organizations will operate across borders today. So outsourcing and offshoring, for example, are far more complex methods of operating between borders. Here we're not just buying and selling goods and services, but we're actually engaged in doing part of our domestic operation, what would traditionally be done domestically in multiple parts of the world. So outsourcing manufacturing, for example, is not the same thing as buying and selling. So Apple doesn't just buy and sell components from China, they outsource their manufacturing to a Chinese company, so in this case Foxconn, who they work closely with. So it would be a mistake to think of say the iPhone as simply a product of China which Apple is purchasing from China. Neither would it be truly accurate to say the iPhone is an American product which just is manufactured in China. It's somewhere in between. Offshoring, again, where you have something which is wholly owned by the company but operating in a different location across national borders, is a very different way of leveraging the location benefits while keeping that particular function in-house. FDI, foreign direct investment. Then you've got other more complex forms like partnerships, so joint ventures, as well as financing agreements and financing processes. Again, a much more complex and varied way of operating across borders than just buying some goods or selling some goods across those borders. Because of this complexity, this means that organizations aren't just blindly buying and selling, but they really need to be deeply in tune with and aware of various differences between different markets. So these can be political differences, as organizations have to, out of necessity, engage with governance authorities simply to be able to enter into a market. Legal differences, any organization which is operating in any market has to rely on legal structures, legal culture, as well as legal institutions like courts and arbitration in order to effectively do business. And there's significant legal differences across borders and in different countries of the world, as well as cultural differences, which may be one of the most important types of differences that organizations have to confront. Coming from something as basic as products and services addressing consumer needs when the cultural context those consumers exist in is so radically different, to different ways of doing business. So when it comes to marketing or HRM, different ways of communicating, all of these kind of things that we sometimes take for granted are very much culturally bound, and therefore international businesses operating across borders really have to understand and operate within these the confines of these differences. And also what we're really moving towards more and more is towards companies and international businesses which are international businesses first. So what we traditionally understand is an organization is a British company or a French company or an Indian company, and they happen to operate in multiple different countries. So a domestic firm which has internationalized. Whereas we are increasingly seeing today born global firms. So these are firms and companies which come into being, which are founded and start operating immediately in different markets. So it's difficult to say that this is really just a French company because their headquarters are in France. If from the very first day they started operating, they were selling products and services in multiple markets, they had multiple offices, they were operating across borders. So that's what we term born global firms. So again, is a very different way of understanding international business. It's understanding international businesses and born global firms as a distinct category unto themselves. These aren't just national companies which happen to do a bit of business in a neighboring country or happen to do a bit of business or outsourcing across the other side of the world, but rather they're a different category of organization, and therefore we need a different set of tools, a different set of models and concepts to really understand how they operate, and they require a different set of tools and techniques to really make decisions that suit this particular unique context. So what we are going to do now is just take a look at this particular term and just break it down into its two constituent parts. So we have international business. In this case, the first word here, international, is the one we're going to focus on. So we say a company or an organization is an international business. What do we really mean by this? What we tend to say is a company operating across borders in the international sphere or the international arena, which we can also term the international stage. International businesses are not alone on this international stage or international arena, that they share the international arena with a great number of other actors. So if we take a look at some of these actors, they are obviously states, so individual countries, depending on how you count, you have between 190 and about 220 countries in the world, and there is a lot of debate and controversy about how you count and what constitutes a country. But by whichever count you take, there's a huge number of states in the world today. But as well as those, we have intergovernmental organizations as well that have significant impact on how other actors can interact and go about their business. So these can include things like the UN, but also the World Trade Organization, the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So lots of intergovernmental organizations are present in the international arena and exert a significant influence on the structures and regime that operates in various parts of the world. We also have international non-governmental organizations which have significant influences and impacts as well. So even things we can think of, international charities, so the International Red Cross, the Red Crescent, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. All of these organizations exist on the international arena, but there is a significant interaction between them and corporations and international businesses. So if you consider the reputational risks that international businesses run when they engage in business in various sectors or various countries and regions around the world, you think about their mode of operation, some ethical dilemmas that frequently come up. INGOs do very much have an influence and exist in a two-way relationship here. So as well as multinational corporations, which are effectively international businesses, we also have transnational diaspora communities. So the diaspora, or a diaspora, is a group of people who perceive their homeland to be somewhere else. So this can be people who have directly migrated. So if you were born and grew up in, say, Nigeria, and you have moved to London, then you are a member of the Nigerian diaspora, and the UK is home to a wide range of diasporas. But remember, the term here that I said was a group of people that perceive their homeland to be somewhere else. You also have people like the Irish community in Boston, who are in most cases 2 to 3 to 4 generations removed from migrating to the US, to Boston from Ireland, but maintain a strong sense of Irish diasporic identity. So it is very much a matter of self-identification. That again has a surprising and significant impact on how multinational corporations and international business operates, from the social and cultural diversity they bring to the marketplace. So there's a significant market in the UK for goods that are perceived to be of Indian origin. It's been quite a long time now. The UK voted its favourite dish, its national dish, to be chicken tikka masala. Now you can argue about whether this is authentically Indian or not, but it's without a doubt something which is presented and perceived to be of Indian or South Asian origin. So diasporic communities are really at the heart of this kind of diverse blending of culture, which can create new opportunities, as well as have significant impacts on international politics and how different actors actually interact with each other on the international or within the international arena. I mentioned the Irish community in Boston have always had a significant impact in how the US government has viewed the troubles between or within Northern Ireland in the UK, and has a significant impact on how the US government has actually mediated and interacted with various parties in the Northern Ireland conflict. Talking of conflict, the last group that we should at least mention, even though we're not going to give a huge amount of focus to it during the unit, is transnational violent groups. So these are groups like ISIS and other actors who really do operate across borders. So they are fundamentally part of the international arena. It's not just a domestic issue or a domestic organizations. and they exert significant influence and affect relationships between states. They affect policy and governance of intergovernmental organizations, and therefore exist within this broader international arena that we really do have to understand as the fundamental context that international business and multinational corporations operate within. So that was our look at the international arena. So if we go back to our screen, looking at our key term here, and we focus on the second term of business, and exactly what do we mean by business? How do we conceive of business? And probably for us, most importantly, how do we propose studying and understanding business itself? Now we have two major approaches here: a mechanistic approach and a complexity approach. Complexity approach being derived from complex systems theory. Now, we're not going to get too deep in the theoretical elements. What we just want to understand is the general approach, because the chances are we are going to have one of these two approaches in our minds as we go through the unit and study the material and trying to develop our understanding of how the international arena and particularly international businesses work. When it comes to the mechanistic approach, and this is the idea that business and how businesses work can really be boiled down to three things: your inputs, your processes, and your outputs. So essentially we have cause and effect. So if an organization takes its inputs, understands its environment, carries out particular processes, it produces predictable and set outputs. So if we want to be successful in business, or we want to understand how organizations become successful, we need to look at the inputs, the processes, the outputs, and we want to match a strategy with the conditions that exist outside the organization and the internal resources it has. So this is like a giant engine. You fiddle with it, you develop your strategies, you observe the conditions outside, you find the appropriate set of processes, you exit it, and you have business success. You have a successful international business, or just a successful business. It's like a giant engine with gears and steam and so on working. Complex system theory, which has become increasingly influential, it's 20-30 years since gaining prominence, has a very different approach. So here the basic premise is that complex systems do not obey simple cause and effect laws. So if you want to understand why something was successful 30 or 40 years ago, you're not just looking to identify 3 or 4 major strategies or 3 and 4 major external conditions and internal resources, but rather we need to understand them as holistic complex systems. So non-linear systems which don't follow straightforward cause and effect laws, and instead are heavily affected by feedback loops. So particular elements of functioning internal processes don't just produce inputs and outputs to the organization, but rather are in existence or exist in a state of balance where they're actually interacting with multiple elements, multiple factors and actors, and those all create feedback loops. So it's very difficult within a complex system to pin down and say, well, thing A leads to thing B. But rather thing A exists within a particular complex system which is always in motion, always changing, always being affected by feedback loops. So what we need to do is not try and have precise predictions about thing A leading to thing B, but rather look for general patterns that we can identify and derive deeper understandings or deeper lessons from those patterns, rather than seeing it as just a straightforward game of developing 5 different strategies and using them in a particular order or using them within a particular context. It's safe to say that if the mechanistic approach was generally or broadly true, it would be much easier to actually run a business or engage in commerce or social activity. It's generally true that understanding why some businesses are successful and other businesses aren't is less about identifying what they did to make them successful, and more about understanding the complex system as a whole. Luck, timing, positioning, social trends, evolution. These things have a much bigger impact at social evolution rather than species evolution, is what I meant. But these things have a really big impact. So as we go through the unit, what we really should not do is think that we're on some kind of magical course where you're going to learn these 7 easy steps to business success. And as long as you follow them, you'll be fine. Anybody who tells you that they are 7 or 10 or 15 easy steps or just steps to business success is trying to sell you some kind of scam course or pyramid scheme. That's not how the world works. That's not how societies work. And we need to understand that business and commercial functioning exist within human societies. And human societies are immensely complex. And defy simple prediction making. They defy simple cause and effect laws. It's a far more complex system. So if you think about something like why was Donald Trump elected or how was Donald Trump elected, anyone that says, well, he was elected because of thing A and thing B, and if you also do thing A and thing B, then you will too be elected, is again not being intellectually honest. And is simplifying things to the point that is just not fundamentally useful. If you want to understand a societal issue like the election of Donald Trump, that requires a deep understanding of social trends, political pressures and fissures within the US, the US's position and interaction with other countries around the world, so the state of globalization, the balance of power. There's a huge number of things that we need to understand. And there's no reason why we shouldn't approach understanding international businesses in the same way. So if you want to understand why Facebook was successful, then if someone says, well, Facebook was successful because they followed these 10 easy steps, again, they're probably trying to scam you by selling you on some stupid course or another. That's not how we understand the success of Facebook. It's a far more complex endeavor, and what we try and do is understand general patterns rather than boiling it down to simple cause and effect. Lastly, what I want to do is just look at different motivations to internationalize. So if we did mention born global firms, but here we're looking at traditional domestic firms who become international companies. So why have they internationalized? Why have they chosen to start operating across different borders and operating in different legal, political, and cultural contexts? We've got a range of reasons here, but what I think it's useful to start with and build up the relationship and the connection between these different reasons. So if you start with one that looks fairly obvious, well, if you have a unique product or service, then why just sell to your domestic market? If you have something special, if you feel that you have some unique advantages to what you're selling, why not make more money by selling them to other consumers, other customers across the border? Money is money, profit is profit, revenue is revenue. So, fairly straightforward motivation to internationalize. We can connect this as well to technological advances as well. So if you have some form of technological advantage, either your product is more advanced, the processes to make your product is more advanced, or you have some kind of advantage in distribution, and then again that gives you a fairly straightforward motive to expand beyond your domestic market and look to other overseas markets as well. Those are based on the strength of your product or service, but we also have other reasons to do so. So overproduction or excess capacity is one. You're producing too much and therefore you have excess product to or service to sell, or you have the ability to produce more. So if your factory is only running at 70% capacity, then with a little bit of additional resource, you could get that to producing at 100% capacity and take the extra 30% and sell it in a different market. That would have a significant benefit to you. This very much taps into a key concept here of economies of scale, and the basic principle here is that if you have Generally your fixed costs won't generally change when you scale up, but your variable costs will, which means that the more you produce of something, the increasingly cheap the per unit cost is. So it may cost a huge amount of money to produce a single smartphone, and it really does cost a huge amount. But once you scale up to selling millions of smartphones, then the per unit cost rapidly comes down. So as we produce more, our individual costs are lower, and that puts us in a very interesting situation. This means we can either maintain our prices and have much greater revenue, much greater profit, so a much larger profit margin, or as our per unit costs go down due to economies of scale, we can lower our price, which will then allows us to more effectively compete against other companies. So if you are an international business and you benefit from economies of scale because you're producing to address multiple markets, not just one market, that gives you an inherent advantage against companies you're competing against who are just domestic companies who are just operating in one market. So this again, in another connection, will lead to saturated domestic markets as well as international competitors come in, which increases the pressure to internationalize as well, to seek out new markets you can expand into. Also, your domestic market may become saturated because there's simply too much competition, or you've already reached a monopoly position. You're not going to keep expanding your sales because pretty much anyone who's buying your product already is. Then expansion becomes the obvious thing. Now, from all of those motives that we've discussed, they're all proactive motivations. They're all positive motivations. So the organization is in a strong position and they wish to leverage this to expand and to grow. However, these aren't the only motivations to internationalize. We also have reactive motivations. You can think of this as a defensive motivation. The organization isn't internationalizing because it's in a position of strength, but rather it's internationalizing because it's in a position of weakness and it needs to internationalize or it potentially is going to go under. So this is the result of competitive pressures, and the really straightforward thing to put here is to understand that all of these proactive motivations are going to lead to companies proactively internationalizing. They will be competing against domestic companies who now are actually being negatively affected. So all of the reasons we've discussed will create a situation where international businesses have significant benefits over any domestic competitor. So if you're an international business, if you're operating across multiple markets, you are going to be in a much stronger position because of economies of scale, technological advantages, location advantages. All of these things are going to put you in a strong position. So now your domestic competitors also have pressure on them to internationalize as well, so they can compete against you effectively. So this is a reactive motivation, but it's a very strong one nonetheless. And lastly, just before we wrap this video up, you also have tax benefits or regulatory benefits. So now this is something we are going to pick up on throughout the unit at various points, but we are going to explore how international businesses and organizations exist within regulatory frameworks. They interact with political and legal systems, and this causes a greater deal of ambiguity. So when you operate across multiple political, legal and regulatory systems, there's potentially additional loopholes or advantages that you could generate from that ambiguity, and we see this in things like transfer pricing. So this is something which is not a advertised notion. It's not something which international businesses are pushing forward as a reason that they wish to grow and expand, but it is nonetheless still very much a reality. Tax benefits do give a significant motivation to internationalize in particular ways. Regulatory benefits do the same also.